On the first morning of December 1948, a couple walking on a beach in Australia found a man lying against the seawall. He was well dressed. His legs were crossed. His head rested back against the stone as though he had simply stopped to watch the sea and fallen asleep. He was dead, and he had no name. Every label had been cut from his clothes. There was no wallet, no identification, nothing to say who he was. And months later, sewn into a tiny hidden pocket, police would find a scrap of paper torn from a book of poems. On it, 2 printed words: Tamám Shud, it is ended. It would take 74 years to put a name to his face. A code he left behind has never been cracked, and to this day, no one can tell you how he died. This is buried pages. The beach was called Somerton Park, a quiet stretch of sand on the edge of the city of Adelaide in South Australia. It was just after 6:30 in the morning when the body was reported. The man was slumped against the seawall, his legs stretched out and crossed at the ankle, one arm resting at his side. Several people had actually walked past him the evening before and assumed he was sleeping or drunk. He was neither. In fact, a couple out for a walk the previous evening had seen him lying in that exact spot. One of them later said they saw him move his arm, or thought they did, and so they left him alone, assuming he was simply a drunk sleeping it off. Another witness thought he saw mosquitoes around the man's face and watched him not so much as flinch. When police arrived the next morning, there was no sign of a struggle, no footprints of a fight, just a half-smoked cigarette resting on his collar, as if it had fallen from his mouth and never burned him at all. He looked to be in his mid-40s. He was tall, fit, athletic in what one examiner called top physical condition, and he was dressed, strangely, for the wrong season and the wrong place. A white shirt, a tie, brown trousers, a knitted pullover, and a smart jacket that appeared to be of American tailoring. On a warm summer beach, he wore all of it. His shoes were the first thing that did not fit. They were clean, polished, spotless. These were not the shoes of a man who had walked across sand to lie down and die. He wore no hat, which in 1948 was unusual for a man dressed this well, and he carried no wallet. Then the police looked closer and found the detail that would define this case for the next 3/4 of a century. Every single label had been cut out of his clothing. Every maker's tag, every mark that could identify where the clothes were bought or who had owned them had been deliberately, carefully removed. Someone had gone to great trouble to make sure this man could never be traced. His pockets held almost nothing, and everything he did carry was ordinary and useless. A train ticket that had never been used, a bus ticket, an American-made aluminum comb, a packet of chewing gum, a box of matches, and a cigarette packet of one brand filled with 7 cigarettes of a different brand entirely. No keys, no papers, no photographs, no name. The body was taken for a post-mortem, and the mystery only deepened. The pathologist who examined him could not determine how he died. Let me say that again, because it is the heart of this whole case. To this day, more than 75 years later, the cause of this man's death has never been officially established. What the examiner found was a body in strange distress. The man's spleen was enormous, roughly 3 times its normal size. His liver was congested and engorged with blood. There was bleeding in his stomach. His last meal, a pasty, had been eaten 3 or 4 hours before he died. To the pathologist, this did not look natural. It looked like poison. He was, in his own words, convinced that this death could not have been natural. But here is the problem. When they tested the body, they found nothing. No trace of any poison, no foreign substance at all. One professor suggested there were certain rare drugs, cardiac poisons, that could kill a man and then break down in the body so completely that they would leave no trace behind, even in an autopsy. Drugs that were, in his words, almost impossible to detect after death. It was a theory. It has never been proven. No poison was ever found in this man, and it never will be. There were other oddities on his body, small ones that would matter much later. The muscles of his calves were unusually high and pronounced, the kind you might see in a dancer, or a man who spent his life in high-heeled boots. He was missing 2 teeth that most people have, and the shape of his ear was a rare variation, found in only a small percentage of people. None of it told them who he was, and because no one could identify him, and the body could not be kept forever, the authorities did something that would turn out to matter more than anyone in that room could have imagined. Before he was buried, they made a plaster cast of his head and shoulders. A death mask. A quiet, ghostly record of a face that no one could name. They had no way of knowing it at the time, but pressed into that plaster were a few strands of the dead man's hair. And more than 70 years later, those strands would be the thread that finally began to unravel all of this. 6 weeks after the body was found, the police caught a break, or thought they had. They discovered that a brown suitcase had been checked into the cloakroom at the Adelaide railway station the day before the man died, and never collected. Inside was a life stripped bare, the same way the body had been. There were clothes, pajamas, slippers, a dressing gown, shaving gear, a pair of trousers with sand still in the cuffs, and a collection of small tools, an electrician's screwdriver, a stenciling brush of the kind used by ship's officers, a knife, and a pair of scissors that had been sharpened and modified into something else. And once again, almost every label had been removed. Almost, on 3 items, a tie, a laundry bag, a singlet someone had missed a name or left it on purpose. The name was Keene, T. Keene, but when police chased it down, they concluded it was almost certainly not the dead man's name. Another dead end wearing the shape of a clue. There was one more thing in that suitcase. A spool of orange waxed thread, an unusual brand not even sold in Australia. And that thread was a perfect match for the thread that had been used to repair a torn pocket in the trousers the dead man was wearing. The suitcase was his. There was no longer any doubt. But it was that repaired pocket that held the strangest thing of all. Hidden inside the waistband of the man's trousers was a small fob pocket, the kind made to hold a watch. And rolled up tightly inside it was a scrap of paper. When they unrolled it, they found 2 words printed, torn from the page of a book. Tamám Shud. It is a phrase from Persian poetry. It means it is ended. It is finished. And it is the very last line of a famous book of poems called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. A dying man with no name and no past was carrying the word finished, hidden against his own body. I want to stop here for a moment because I want you to feel the shape of this. A man dies on a beach. Every trace of his identity has been surgically removed. The cause of death is a poison that leaves no poison. And the one clue he carries is a single word hidden in a secret pocket. That means it is over. This is not a crime scene that was cleaned up in a panic. This is careful. This is deliberate. Someone, whether the dead man himself or somebody else, wanted this to be a mystery. And for 74 years, they got their wish. The police put out a public appeal. That torn scrap had to come from somewhere. Somewhere out there was a copy of the Rubaiyat with its final page ripped out. And someone came forward. A man said that around the time of the death, he had found a copy of that exact book lying in the back seat of his car, which had been parked, unlocked on a street in the beach suburb of Glenelg. He had no idea how it got there. And when police checked it, the final page, the page with the words Tamám Shud, had been torn out. The scrap from the body fit the tier exactly. But the book was not finished with them yet. On the inside back cover, faint, pressed into the paper in pencil, were 2 things. The first was a series of letters. 5 lines of capital letters with 1 line crossed out. It looked for all the world like a code. Some of the best cryptographers in the country were brought in to break it. Then, decades later, military intelligence tried again. Then university teams and amateur codebreakers by the thousands for years. And I have to tell you the truth about that code. It has never been solved. Not once, not by anyone in more than 70 years. The best modern analysis suggests the letters may not even be a cipher at all, but the initials of words, a private shorthand, which would mean the original message may be lost forever. The second thing penciled in that book was a telephone number. The number belonged to a young nurse who lived in Glenelg, barely a few hundred meters from where the man's body was found. In the case, she is known by the name Justin. When she was shown a plaster cast of the dead man's face, witnesses said she looked as though she might faint, that she was completely taken aback. But she told police she did not know him, and she would take whatever she knew to her grave. To this day, no one has ever proven what her connection to the man was, or whether she knew him at all. Her phone number in that book is real. Its meaning is not known. Years later, some researchers would point to another strange coincidence. Jessica Thompson had a young son, and that boy, they noted, appeared to share two of the dead man's rarest features, the same missing teeth, the same unusual ear. Statistically, that combination is extraordinarily uncommon. To some, it hinted that the man on the beach and this family were somehow connected. But I have to be clear, this was never tested, never proven, and the people involved have always denied any link. It is a coincidence that raises a question. It is not an answer. So who was he? For decades, the theories filled the silence, and the most famous of them was espionage. Think about the timing. It was 1948, the very start of the Cold War. Not far from Adelaide was a secret weapons testing range. Here was a man with no identity, an untranslatable code, and a poison that could not be found. To many, it added up to one thing: a spy. But I want to be careful here because it is a theory and only a theory. There is no document, no record, no piece of evidence that has ever shown this man was a spy. It is a story that fits the shape of the mystery. It is not a fact. Others believed the answer was simpler and sadder. A man carrying the word finished. A phone number for a woman who reacted as though she had seen a ghost. To them, this was a story of heartbreak, of a man who came to that beach to end his own life. But even that cannot be proven because we still do not know how he died. And so the man on the beach stayed nameless for decades, through the deaths of nearly everyone who had touched the case. Over the years, more than 250 people were put forward as possible names for him. Missing husbands, runaway fathers, sailors who never came home. One by one, every single one of them was ruled out. And in that whole time, something quietly strange kept happening at his grave. Flowers would appear on it, fresh ones, left by someone no one could identify. For years, an anonymous hand tended the resting place of a man that supposedly nobody knew. But one man refused to let it go. A professor of engineering in Adelaide became quietly obsessed with the case and spent more than 15 years chasing it. He tracked down the old death mask. He argued for years that the only way to ever name this man was to dig him up and read his DNA. Officials resisted. The grave had been sealed for half a century, but the professor kept pushing. And finally, in 2021, the authorities agreed to exhume the body from the grave where the man had been buried, under a headstone that simply called him the Unknown Man. And in 2022 came the answer that so many had waited a lifetime for. A professor at the University of Adelaide, working with an American forensic genealogist, took DNA, not from the body, which had degraded, but from strands of hair that had been trapped in the plaster of that death mask, made back in 1949. They ran it through a genealogy database, built a family tree of thousands of people, and followed it down to a single name. They believed the Somerton Man was an electrical engineer named Carl Webb, born in Melbourne in 1905. A quiet man they found who wrote poetry about death, and who had, years before, tried to take his own life. The picture that emerged of Webb was a lonely one. He had been married, but his wife had left him and moved away to another state. His family had scattered. By the late 1940s, the records of his life simply stopped. No death certificate, no grave under his own name. He seems to have walked out of his old life and somehow ended up on a beach on the other side of the country with every label cut from his clothes. It felt like the end, but I have to be honest with you about what that answer is and what it is not. This is a conclusion reached by researchers using DNA and genealogy. It is compelling, but as of now, it has not been officially confirmed by the coroner. The authorities have called it, at most, cautiously promising. And even if the name is right, look at everything it does not explain. It does not tell us how he died. It does not break the code. It does not tell us why every label was cut from his clothes, or why he was on that beach, hundreds of miles from home, or what a nurse in Glenelg had to do with any of it. We may finally have his name. We still do not have his story. So think about what this man managed to do. He walked onto a beach, sat down against a wall, and died. And in doing so, he left behind a puzzle so complete, so carefully sealed, that it outlived him by 3/4 of a century and outlived nearly everyone who ever tried to solve it. A body with no name, a poison with no trace, a code with no answer, and a single word hidden against his heart that told us only one thing: that it was ended. Where does a man go to disappear so completely that even his own death becomes a locked door? And why would he carry the word finished all the way to the sea?